If Pope John Paul II in Centesimus Annus did not give 2 cheers for democracy and capitalism, he did give at least 1 cheer. From a church that has passed through many bad systems in history and whose main business is eternal life, 1 cheer for any worldly system is quite a lot. For in Christian eyes, no worldly system deserves 3 cheers. All are flawed. Consider democracy. Democracy, Reinhold Niebuhr once said, the greatest American theologian after Jonathan Edwards. Reinhold Niebuhr once said, even before Winston Churchill, democracy is a poor form of government, except that all the other forms are worse. Under democracy, the tyranny of a majority is as much a danger to minorities and individuals as is a single tyrant. In fact, it's worse because you can't argue with the mob. You can petition and beg a tyrant, but not a mob. So the founders were exceedingly afraid of majorities. Unbridled democracy, majority rule, unchecked by protections for individual rights, unbalanced, irresponsibly exercised, is a misfortune. Religious power has also been abused, especially when intermixed with the power of the state. It should not surprise us, therefore, that, quote, unbridled capitalism and even the unbridled pursuit of wealth creation, indeed, and unbridled anything, arouses fears in ordinary people. This is true even of unbridled liberty of thought and expression, although philosophers might offer good reasons for being laissez-faire in this sphere as in no other. Thus, free societies in the West have in practice approached the institutionalization of liberty cautiously by balancing one liberty against another. Under such practical arrangements, no liberty runs entirely unchecked. Every power is assigned its counterpower, every office its countervailing force. The reason behind these checks and balances is a classical Christian and Jewish observation. Every human being sometimes sins. From this fact is drawn a political principle. Trust no one with excessive power, and don't trust any institution either. Where it says, in God we trust, on American coinage, the operational meaning of that is nobody else. In God we trust, but not in Congress, not in judges, not in executive power. You make 2 Congresses, one to check the other. 2 sets of judges appointed and elected. And you get to kick out the current president, the current executives, every 4 years, which is, in a way, sometimes the only really practical effect of democracy, is to kick people out of power. It's hard to get the votes to do what you want, but you can stop it when it's too bad. And that's not an unimportant power. But it's based on a kind of mistrust. It's the great difference between the French Revolution and the American, in fact, between most revolutions in the last 200 years, is they all think they have diagnosed a flaw in systems which they can correct with a new system, and in that new situation, man will be perfectible. He will be wholly good. It never happens. The Americans didn't build that way. The Americans were very influenced by the Protestant preachers of the time, by St. Augustine. St. Augustine was the one father of the church that most Protestants venerated and studied. And he had such a profound sense of evil and pervasiveness of human weakness. You know, you can't quite trust judges. They hear evidence, contrary evidence, from people who look like they're passionately telling the truth. And they don't know quite what to believe, except as experience helps them, and wisdom helps them, and virtue helps them, as Solomon said, well, if you two women can't decide whose baby it is, let's just split it. You each have half. And one protested vigorously, and the other not. So he awarded the baby to the woman who protested most vigorously. Your wife comes down for the morning for breakfast, and she says, good morning. And you say to yourself, what did she mean by that? Trying to catch the tone. Or, you know, I mean, you don't know what the other person is thinking. You really don't. And, okay. Now, Reinhold Niebuhr once said that original sin is the only doctrine of the church that you don't have to believe. All you have to have is a little introspection. Just examine your own conduct, and you'll get the point. The things you've done that you know you should not have done, and reverse. Okay. In most societies, we owe that part to the Protestant Christian heritage. It's Catholic too, of course, but in our case, most of these things were articulated by very enlightened Protestant leadership. By that I mean, by very enlightened, I mean they believed, as almost no other generations of Protestants have believed, very strongly in the importance of reason and faith. In their sermons, they frequently gave arguments in favor of liberty based on arguments from Hobbes and Locke and others, from reason, and then arguments based on scriptural texts. The truth shall make you free, and so forth. And they took great comfort in the fact that strategically there were these two arms advancing on the front, and they supported one another. That's the way they argued. Okay. In most free societies, therefore, the three great systems of human life are placed in balance against one another, like the 3 points of a triangle. You know, the founders decided to create a new seal of the United States for official documents. And they designated a committee of 3, as I remember, Franklin and Jefferson, and I can't remember the third. Probably Madison, but I don't remember. And they came up with a seal which we see on the back of a dollar bill. It's not a triangle, but it's an incompleted pyramid. And it's uncompleted because although the nation is committed to freedom and justice for all, you're never going to get there. In fact, you're lucky if you don't backslide in every generation. Even keeping where you are is difficult, let alone advancing on it. So the pyramid was destined never to be completed. And across the bottom, the inscription in Latin, which Catholics used to get, and Americans now do through the number of the Super Bowls, the date, 1776. And what does 1776 suggest? Not only the date of the Declaration of Independence, but also the publication of the inquiry into the nature and cause of the wealth of nations. And this position was called by many one of the aspects of what was called the Whig tradition, was this notion of the creation of wealth through intellect. And I was telling one of you, I read, and I think I'm right about this, that there were more colleges and universities in the state of Ohio in 1872 than in all of Europe combined. Antioch and Oberlin, and just dozens of it in small towns, built by the people of those towns through quilt sales and bake sales and other things. Anyway, so that triangle is not meant to be Masonic. It's meant to show that this is the first description underneath it says Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new order of the ages. Now, this is 4 million people who, after independence, couldn't govern themselves well at all. It looked like it was all going to fall apart, and people were saying that you were better governed under the king. Why did you go through all this? And they claim for themselves the new order of the ages. I mean, it's a preposterous claim on the face of it. And then the design of their order was at the base and on the other two sides, a three-sided system. Political, because without law, without a government of law, you really can't have a free economy. And you can't have protection for freedom of conscience and inquiry and the arts and the sciences. And you have to have all three strains. Okay. In most free societies today, therefore, the three great systems of human life are placed in balance against one another, like the 3 points of a triangle: the political system, the economic system, and the moral cultural system. No person and no institution can easily master all three of these forms of power. And each of them, in any case, has internal interests contrary to the other two. In the struggle for equilibrium among all three systems, the hope is, no one will gain excessive power. I was often a speechwriter with candidates, presidential candidates, and I had many experiences of sitting down at table with, they'd be trying to raise funds from X, Y, or Z, wealthy family, business. And I remember the candidates, I'd catch the business people would be explaining their idea of what should be done. And the candidate and maybe the other advisors on his staff looking at this guy, oh my God, this is so out of touch with political reality. They didn't like business people. And the business people couldn't figure out how politicians think. It's so contrary to practicality. And the intellectuals, the clergy, usually don't like either one. Either the political people or the business people. And they don't particularly respect the clergy either. They think they're out of touch, idealistic. Good to have them, but not to be followed. The whole system, do you see, is based on that mistrust. The whole system is based on groups in whose interest it is to pursue their own way of thinking and to be quite suspicious of the other two. And that's healthy. That's the American belief. All powers must be checked. In our day, for example, the media of communication are now central to the exercise of most forms of power. Through them, the intellectuals, artists, journalists, experts, and clergy accrue a disproportionate and novel power. It's the new elite. The symbol makers, the ones who create the symbols and the myths through which we live and understand ourselves. And that's an enormous power. You can see how it worked first in abortion. When the Supreme Court ruled in 1972 against abortion, it was the first time in American history any force for law had looked on abortion not necessarily favorably, but permissively. The worst name you could call anybody morally until that time was abortionist. What a cruel art that is. And surrounded by shame. And suddenly, abortion clinics started springing up. I never until that time saw anything change, anything so deep, change so rapidly in my life. Now we're seeing it with same-sex marriage. 10 years ago, nobody could have predicted that had a ghost of a chance. But when the media get behind it, whoosh, it sways lots of people, makes them doubt, creates another alternative in their mind. The United States wasn't quite built for that, and we haven't learned yet how to live with that unchecked power. In counterpoise, queens, prime ministers, party leaders, parliamentarians, judges, and political activists exercise considerable social power through the levers of the state, which today in some ways exceeds the power of all previous states. But they do not control everything, not the opinions of the idea class, perhaps not the compliance of their own bureaucracies, and certainly not economic regularities, which may undo them. Ignore them as you will, economic laws bite. Finally, leaders of commerce and industry, bankers, brokers, and advertisers, labor union leaders, consumers, and many other economic agents exercise considerable social power. But their power, too, is severely limited. For one thing, they rank low in the esteem of clergymen, intellectuals, artists, and journalists, and their failures and achievements are seldom treated without remarkable antipathy. The only villains you can portray in television or in the movies are business leaders. If you finger any ethnic group for this or that problem, you'll be bitterly rejected. It's got to be males, white males, and in business. It's the one minority that's still not permissible only, but almost mandatory in polite company to excoriate. Think of it this way. Suppose someone says to you, you have bourgeois tastes. You may not understand especially from Europe, if somebody says it. You may not understand exactly what they mean, but you know it isn't good. On the contrary, if they say, he's a prince, or Maria's a princess, you should feel pretty good about that. Until you study the history of princes and princesses. Mostly they put their nephews in the Tower of London, murdered rivals, and created almost nothing beautiful. They paid for it. They were patrons, which is very good. But the most beautiful things in the world, the best cutlery, the best china, the best wines, the best cheeses, are all made by the bourgeoisie. Small business owners who take pride down the generations in their craft and bring it to a very high art. So what's wrong with it being said that you have bourgeois taste? And that's where all the great beauty is made. Anyway, I'm just trying to point out the way the images through which we think are frequently out of touch with reality. That's what gives the symbol maker such power. For another thing, government can do more harm to them, that's to the business people, than they can do to government. Through regulations, laws, rulings, and taxes, government coerces them into compliance. Conflict between the two systems is inherently tilted toward the power of government. The system as a whole is meant to be this way, so that its three major systems are internally divided against one another. This tripartite counterpoise is what we call democratic capitalism. In some places, social democracy might be a more acceptable term, as in Europe. And in the historical context of 1945, 1948, accordingly, the Germans chose the term social market economy. Was von Hayek pointed out to the principal German architect of the social market economy. Markets are inherently social. It was not necessary to say social twice. And he agreed, the president agreed. But I said the Germans need the word social in there. And you can see that already in Julius Caesar, in the Gallic Wars, his first battles against Germanic tribes. How they stick together and fight together as no other tribes he had encountered. In this context, the question I wish to raise concerns the main religious justification for a capitalist system understood in this way, that is, one that is balanced by a constitutional democracy protecting individual rights on the one hand, and by moral cultural institutions, such as those of Jewish, Christian, and humanist traditions on the other hand. For many persons, the primary moral justification for capitalism is the free space it creates in society, the independence of property owners, the freedom of economic choices, and ample civic liberties. For others, the primary moral justification is the widespread social prosperity capitalism brings. It ended famine, almost, and destitution, while steadily bringing about improvements in the living standards of the poor. It is not difficult to accept these moral claims as valid, at least when the only contemporary alternatives are real existing socialism and third world mercantilism. I'm thinking my way back to the world of 1991 when Centesimus Annus was. Nevertheless, my own primary moral claim for capitalism calls attention to a different moral strength. Here we may take a cue from John Paul II's Centesimus Annus. The underlying principle of the Pope's anthropology is the creative subjectivity of the human person. From his earliest work on, including his phenomenological inquiry, The Acting Person, for which Harvard gave him, as Archbishop of Krakow, an honorary degree, the Pope has been struck by the human being's most arresting characteristic, its capacity to originate action, that is, to imagine and to conceive of new things, rerum novarum, and then to do them. He finds in man's creative acts the deepest clue to human identity. You know, cats and dogs go on living as they have, well, since the time of the Pharaoh, since the Sphinx was made in the cat's image. They go on behaving the same way. Our children don't. Our children strike out on new paths. Maybe they change religion. Maybe they change politics. Almost surely they change profession from that of their parents. Not always, but disproportionately nowadays. Whereas in the old days, you were fixed. What your father did, you did. An unbeliever may achieve this insight with no benefit of religious belief. Karl Wojtyla approached it from two different directions. First, in a philosophical way. Second, in a Jewish-Christian way. For him, philosophy and theology meet in the anthropology of the real existing human person. Philosophy sees homo creator. Theology sees imago Dei. Man, the creator, in philosophy, is made in the image of the divine creator in theology, and is endowed by him with an inalienable right to personal initiative. Our rights are endowed with us by the Creator, not by states, not by civil society, as John Locke argued. From this principle, Pope John Paul II derives a corollary for social systems. It is an affront to human dignity for a social system to repress the human capacity to create, to invent, or to be enterprising. What an awful system it is that represses its most active creative citizens. I mean, it's cutting off its nose. It's punishing itself. Yet that's the way the laws of most countries on earth are constructed. Wojtyla sees the principle of liberty, and for him this liberty naturally deploys itself in three fields: in conscience, in inquiry, and in action. It would be fair to say in this respect that Pope John Paul II is a philosopher of liberty, maybe the philosopher of liberty in our time. Deeper than liberty, however, in his view, is creativity. Of these two notions, liberty alone does not satisfy. It raises further questions. Creativity must be free, but freedom is for something and must be ordered by something. In fact, Pope John Paul II said in his first visit to the United States that every civilization has added to the patrimony of Catholic faith, of Christian faith. The Romans, through the practicality they gave to administration, and the rather deep affection they gained among conquered peoples almost everywhere for bringing them an ordered kind of government. And still today we call on Roman law and Roman virtues. And the French gave an élan, an upward thrust, a special spirit of freshness, an experiment that was new, and so on. And the American contribution, he says, gave the world the idea of ordered liberty. Confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. Law and liberty are not enemies. For a long time in Rome, I saw a sign, often, for example, alongside an entrance, the arch of an aqueduct through which the road passed, and it was narrow. And so what I thought rallentare meant from observing behavior is beep your horn and speed up. I had a big laugh when I learned that it meant very slow. Really slow down. Nobody did that. Law and liberty are different things in Italy, if I may say. In a delightful way. In Britain, people queue up to get on a bus, and they're quite offended if you try to break the queue. No such order in Italy. Getting on a bus is every man, every woman for herself. It's the most sensuous experience in human civilized urban life. You're lucky if a part of your body goes untouched. Okay. But the Italians speak all the time about community, comunità, solidarità. And the Anglos speak much about the individual. We tend to use the word individual rather than person, which is a mistake, but nonetheless, there we are. And in fact, the Anglos are more ordered, more socially conscious, more respectful of one another under law. And the night of the millennium in Rome, we happened to be in Rome with an alumni group, and our bus had to go from St. Peter's Square, where we had tickets, to near Castel Gandolfo. And getting across the piazzas of Rome was a nightmare. There was no law, there was no order, there was complete laissez-faire. And nobody would budge. Nobody would automatically let one car through and then continue and then let another car through. No order like that. Just beep, beep, and every inch, move 2 or 3 inches forward and keep that edge. Okay. People usually preach against their own weakness. Italy, you need more comunità, more ordered liberty. And in the United States, we need more communio, more social. And so we tend to speak that way. Okay. Perhaps I should say the reverse. We tend to have such ordered liberty, such respect, that we need to preach more about individuality and the need for, like people who move to the West, to abandon their families, to take a risk, to make a brave decision. I'm going to take my family. Who knows where? Who knows what will happen? Without that individual spirit, you couldn't have built the country. On the other hand, once they got there, what did they do? Well, we found the diary of an ancestor of my wife's who was the first white man to settle part of Iowa and to cut the earth, the rich earth of Iowa, with a plow. It never had been done. The Indians lived there, but very few. They used it for hunting. They didn't plant. Okay, but if you look in his diary, every day they're putting up a building for one another, helping with Smith's house, and then Jones's house, working on the school, building the church. Anything they wanted, they had to build themselves, and they did it as a community. But he never once mentions that in his diary. He talks about the need for brave, strong, responsible individuals. Well, you can see why. I mean, that was the reality of his life. But the other reality of his life, which he didn't pay much attention to, he took for granted, was the communitarian nature of it. The great achievement of Americans across the continent, I think, was building communities. It wasn't the cowboy, the lonely cowboy. It was the building of communities. And yet that doesn't show up in much social theory in America. Okay, at the beginning of his pontificate, for example, Pope John Paul II used the word capitalism in a somewhat pejorative sense, as it is often used in European countries, the more so wherever the Marxist tradition has been strong, but also where the aristocratic tradition has been strong. It's surprising the number of companies in Italy, capitalist companies, which are built by the old aristocratic families that had the wealth to begin with. So in a curious way, the elites have remained the same, but under a new name. Once as aristocrats, now as corporate owners. And so the word capitalism has a power down meaning in Europe that's not quite like that of America. Not at all like that of America. So capitalism has a pejorative sense most often in Europe, in most places. As we saw in his first social encyclical, Laborem Exercens, John Paul II used capital to mean things, objects, instruments of production. He reserved for the word labor all humane and virtuous attributes, including creative subjectivity. But already in that term were the seeds of an idea to be developed. Then in Sollicitudo Rei Socialis, the Pope moved from the acting person and creative subjectivity to the fundamental human right of personal economic initiative. Now, to the best of my knowledge, that's the first time it's articulated in intellectual history in that time. The right, the personal economic initiative, is a right inherent in the person and in the creative subjectivity of the person. And, he's saying that in a communist country, communist-dominated country, of Poland, where it's threatening, to say the least. This was the strongest recognition of enterprise in Catholic social thought, although there are antecedents in Pius XII and in other popes. So it wasn't a break from tradition, but it was a crisp articulation of the tradition in an unprecedented way. The Pope saw enterprise as a vocation, as a virtue, and as a right. That's really that's better than any English thinker did. With Centesimus Annus, Wojtyła's conception of enterprise had flowered into a fully institutional conception. He had moved beyond enterprise as a vocation, a virtue, and a right to the sorts of institutions necessary for its flowering. That step taken, he moved into a theory of the business firm, and then to a critique of the welfare state in paragraph 48. At the heart of each of these views lies his fundamental insight. Every woman and every man has been created in the image of the Creator in order to help co-create the future of the world in economic and other spheres. Thus, the Pope emphasizes how noble it is and how many complex talents are required to gain insight into the economic needs of the human race, to organize available resources, to invent new resources and methods, and to lead a cooperative, voluntary community to achieve real results. But how can such a long and complex sequence of actions take place systematically, regularly, routinely? For that to happen, the Pope sees, a society would need a system of free choice markets, the broadly diffused virtue of enterprise, which is the dynamic factor, not the market, but the dynamic factor, is the creative subjectivity of individual citizens. Property at the Creator's own disposal, a well-governed and ordered society of law, and relative liberty from state control. If this is what is meant by capitalism, the Pope says in the justly famous section 42 of Centesimus Annus, that is, quote, an economic system which recognizes the fundamental and positive role of business, the market, private property, and the resulting responsibility for the means of production, as well as free human creativity in the economic sector, then certainly the Church is quite affirmative about it. This affirmative judgment has two conditions, however, very much like those I mentioned at the beginning in describing the tripartite structure of democratic capitalism. Capitalism must be circumscribed by a strong juridical framework which places it at the service of human freedom in its totality. And second, capitalism must be practiced always in light of the ethical and religious core of that freedom. In other words, economic freedom must be balanced by A, a juridical constitutional democracy protecting individual rights, and B, a set of moral cultural institutions that embody the Western religious and philosophical tradition of the virtues. Am I too far behind? Well, I can just abbreviate, that's all.
Yeah, maybe abbreviate. It's good to have some time for discussion.
Yeah, you have the text, and so In summary, the deepest moral justification for a capitalist system is not solely that poor system as it is, it serves liberty better than any other known system, nor even that it raises up the living standards of the poor higher and faster than any other system ever has, nor that it better improves the state of human health and the balance between humans and the environment than either real existing socialism has or the traditional third world society. All these things, however difficult for one to admit, are empirically true. I mean, it just is true that when China and India adopted capitalist methods, they raised considerably more than 500 million people out of poverty. In the poorest parts of the world, Southeast Asia, by far poorer than Latin America or Africa even. But they jumped ahead. Now they're ahead of Africa for sure, and possibly of Latin America. That happened in 30 years. Never have so many people been moved out of poverty so quickly, anywhere. So whatever you may say about it, it's good for the poor.